Member for Regina, Lewvan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, for a very eloquent speech and a very interesting history lesson. It's great to have a fellow alumnus of the Canadian University Society for Intercollegiate Debate in this House. And I would ask the member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, given his enthusiasm for secret ballots, whether he would support a system whereby we have votes in every Canadian workplace periodically on whether the employees want a union. Because it seems that the Conservatives' supposed concern for workplace democracy only starts after employees have indicated that they want a union by signing membership cards. Now, the member suggests that this period of deliberation between signing cards and the vote is a good opportunity for debate and deliberation, but would he not acknowledge the fact that whereas unions have essentially no access to the employees that they're trying to organize, the employer has continual access to those employees during work hours. The employer has authority over those workers, and that creates a massive imbalance during this period of hoped-for deliberation. Thank you.
For Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member, who is indeed an alumnus of the Canadian University Society for Intercollegiate Debate, along with me. I understand the Prime Minister was part of that society at one time as well, but he dropped out after the society could no longer afford his speaking fees. Now, I want to I want to respond to his question, though, in terms of a potential imbalance. Of course, employers have regular access to employees, and employees have regular access to each other. And both of these are different dynamics in a certification discussion. That's why we think, though, that a secret ballot makes sense. You could imagine pressure exerted by an employer. You could imagine cases in which pressure is exerted by fellow employees as well. You could imagine cases where an employee is reluctant to express their opposition to a union because if certification happened anyways, then they would, in some sense, their situation would be significantly affected by the union. So I say, why not a secret ballot? Now, he talks about why not have regular secret ballots. Well, I mean, if the state were to say that we have to have votes on certification on a regular basis in every workplace, where even if there hadn't been any kind of expression of interest. I mean, I think that's relatively impractical. We would have to agree. Let's let workers express interest, and then let's have a secret ballot in cases where that happens. That seems like the most reasonable, practical way to proceed.
Resuming debate, the member for Regina, Lewvan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we resume a debate on Bill C-4 today, it's important to remember why unions matter. Unions provide better pay, pensions, and benefits. Unions provide healthier and safer workplaces. Now, some would argue that, well, unions might have been necessary in a Dickensian era. Workers are now already protected by good regulations. But the reality in many workplaces, Mr. Speaker, is that labor and safety regulations are only really applied if a union is present to call attention to those issues. Unions give employees a voice in their workplace, and that feedback is often very useful to management and indeed can help to improve productivity. Countries with higher rates of unionization enjoy better living standards, greater equality, and more stable economies. I believe that this House should maintain an industrial relations regime that facilitates employees forming unions and bargaining collectively. Unfortunately, the former Conservative government did the opposite. Bill C-525 made it harder to form unions and easier to decertify them. Now, the Conservatives would say that this bill is all about allowing workers to vote on their union status. But the Conservatives have not implemented a system that would allow elections in all workplaces across the country to determine whether employees want a union. The Conservatives' supposed interest in workplace democracy only kicks in after workers have indicated that they want to join a union by signing membership cards. Bill C-525 essentially places another hurdle in the way of employees seeking to join a union. And this delay is not simply a matter of inconvenience. In far too many cases, Mr. Speaker, it has provided an opportunity for employers to intimidate their employees and prevent unionization. Moving on to Bill C-377, this legislation imposes onerous administrative requirements on unions. Now, the Conservatives would have us believe that it's all about transparency. And I think that everyone in this House believes that unions should and do provide financial statements to their members. That happened for decades before this legislation was enacted, and it will continue to happen after it is repealed. But Bill 377 went far beyond financial statements. It required unions to disclose and account for each individual transaction over $5,000. Mr. Speaker, if this House ever applied that type of transparency to a business, the Conservatives would be up screaming about red tape and compliance costs. And indeed, Bill 377 would have cost millions of dollars for the Canada Revenue Agency to administer. One of the more clever arguments that the Conservatives made in this debate was that international unions operating in Canada are already subject to such requirements through the U.S. Department of Labor. Mr. Speaker, before the people of Regina, Lewvan elected me, I worked as an economist for the United Steelworkers Union. And I'm here to tell this House that Bill 377 does not align with the American disclosure requirements, and in fact, it goes far, far beyond them. So, I am very happy to vote in favor of Bill C-4, but simply repealing the most egregious Conservative attacks on working people is not enough. Much more is going to be needed to improve the situation of working Canadians. Often in this debate, the Liberals have spoken about the need for balance in industrial relations. One aspect of that balance is that in the rare cases where the collective bargaining process breaks down, both sides bear an economic cost. In a strike or a lockout, the employer must make do without the workers' labor, the workers must make do without their wages. So there's pressure on both sides to come to a resolution. However, if the employer can simply bring in replacement workers, that destroys this balance. I'm very pleased that my colleague from Jonquière has introduced a private member's bill to restore balance in this situation. In recent minority parliaments, the Liberals spoke very positively about anti-scab legislation, but they never quite produced enough votes to actually pass it. Well, now, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals have a majority. They have the ability to pass whatever legislation they want. And how the Liberals vote on anti-scab legislation will be a crucial test of whether this government plans to live up to its rhetoric about respecting workers' rights and strengthening the middle class. Mr. Speaker, many other important workplace issues go beyond industrial relations. In the election, the Liberals promised to improve the Canada Pension Plan. Now, Mr. Speaker, it took 3 ghosts to convince Ebenezer Scrooge. But when the finance minister met with the provinces before Christmas, it took only 2 ghosts, Christy Clark and Brad Wall, to scare him away from improving the Canada Pension Plan. And as a proud Saskatchewanite, I found it rather strange that our Premier used the downturn in commodities to argue against improving the Canada Pension Plan rather than in favor of improving employment insurance that actually would have helped the affected workers. And despite all the Conservative rhetoric we've heard in this House about the need to respect the oil and gas sector, I think it's telling that Conservative MPs won't stand up and support better access to employment insurance for laid-off energy workers. I'm proud of the fact that the NDP is pushing for better employment insurance. In the election, the Liberals also talked about better employment insurance. But yesterday, they were up speaking against our Opposition Day motion to achieve exactly that. The specific Liberal objection was to a national entrance requirement of 360 hours. And, Mr. Speaker, I would just remember that when the Liberals were on this side of the House, they were demanding precisely that policy. But now the Liberals are saying that regional differences in labour markets need to be respected. And certainly those regional differences exist, but if someone is laid off in a region of high unemployment or low unemployment, they're still out of a job and they still need income support. What the Liberals haven't explained is why the entrance requirement is the aspect of employment insurance that should vary in response to regional differences, because it's still the case that the duration of EI benefits varies according to the regional unemployment rate, and there's a logic that it probably takes longer to find a job in an area with a higher unemployment rate. The NDP motion allows the duration of EI benefits to continue to vary according to regional differences. Mr. Speaker, there are also problems and lags in measuring regional unemployment. Regina is near the epicenter of the downturn in the oil and gas sector. Yet the measured unemployment rate in my community is still low enough that the entrance requirement for EI remains at the national maximum of 700 hours. Mr. Speaker, imagine someone working part-time for 25 hours a week, and imagine that they work for half the year. Well, 25 hours a week times 26 weeks is 650 hours. Not enough to qualify for employment insurance. Someone in Regina could pay into EI for half a year and then when they're laid off, receive no benefit whatsoever. Mr. Speaker, that's unfair, and that's why we need a national entrance requirement of 360 hours. The NDP will vote for Bill C4. But working Canadians also need the Liberals to vote for our Opposition Day motion to improve employment insurance, to vote for the private members' bill to enact anti-scab legislation, and to keep their promise to improve the Canada Pension Plan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Shefford.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais féliciter mon honorable collègue pour son discours éclairant. C'est connu, Monsieur le Président, la clé du développement de nos organisations, c'est la collaboration entre le partenariat entre les syndicats et les employeurs. Ma question est la suivante pour mon collègue. Comment ce nouveau projet de loi-là protège de façon plus juste et équilibrée nos relations de travail entre employeurs et syndicats?
Député de Regina, Lewvan.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure exactly which motion or bill might have been asked about because I tried to address several in my speech, but we're debating Bill C4, so I assume the question is about that legislation. I think it really does improve collaboration by doing away with the most egregious conservative attacks on working people and on unions, but it's clearly not enough, Mr. Speaker. If we really want to have balance in the workplace, it's important, as I said in my speech, that the employer not be allowed to simply bring in replacement workers when there's a legitimate strike or lockout underway. So we also need to pass anti-scab legislation. I'm very proud that that has come forward as a private member's bill. So I would say, Mr. Speaker, I agree with my colleague across the way that Bill C4 is a good start, but much more is required to really achieve justice for working people in this country.
Questions and comments? A member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for his speech. Not every union member in Canada wants their union dues spent to support a political party that they don't support. They want the protection of a secret ballot. I'm interested to hear the member explain how replacing Bill 377 and Bill 525 with C4 will do anything to protect the workers' rights.
Member for Regina, Lewvan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the member for Sarnia talks about union members possibly not wanting their dues spent to support political parties. Well, I've got good news for the member for Sarnia, which is that neither corporate nor union contributions are allowed to federal political parties. I certainly support that change to our democracy. Now, I think what the member for Sarnia might be getting at is in some provinces at the provincial level, corporate and union donations are allowed to political parties. I think the solution to that is for provincial governments to follow the fine federal example and ban both corporate and union donations. But if we are in a jurisdiction where those sorts of contributions are allowed, then the important thing is to just have a democratic process within the union to determine how funds are spent and whether and how they're contributed. And I think that's the appropriate way for workers to be able to defend their interests in the democratic process. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Saskatoon Grasswood.
Speaker, I think I'll refresh the member of Regina Lewvan's memory in the House. As 3 times during the federal election, we saw union members line up behind the leader of the Liberal Party for selfies. Many of them were paid.
Excuse me. Point d'ordre. I think the problem is the translation. It's a function of L'honorable député Drummond.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
L'honorable député Drummond.
Je pense que l'interprétation en français ne fonctionne pas. Pourrait-on vérifier cela?
Non, je devrais parler quelques secondes en français pour assurer que ça commence encore à fonctionner. Je m'attends, oui, je comprends que ça fonctionne encore. Honourable member for Saskatoon Grasswood.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. I just want to remind the honourable member from Regina Lewvan, as in the House here, it has been notified that the Liberal Party during the election 3 times had union members line up behind the Liberal leader. Not once, not twice, but 3 times, all for $100 to get the selfie with the leader of the Liberal Party. So, what do you say about that, Mr. Speaker? We would like to hear the comments from Regina Lewvan about union members used for political operations like we just saw in the federal election.
The honourable member for Regina Lewvan.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I mean, obviously it would be inappropriate for a union to contribute money to a political party or, to pay staff to work on a federal political campaign. So if that happened in the last election, certainly it would need to be investigated, an enforcement action would need to be taken. Having said that, I mean, union members obviously need to be free, like other citizens, to participate in the democratic process. And I suspect that some of those union members who are taking selfies behind the Prime Minister might soon be regretting that decision when they discover that the Liberals aren't moving to implement a federal minimum wage, may not vote to enact anti-scab legislation, maybe voting against the NDP motion to improve employment insurance. So I suspect next time they'll be taking selfies behind NDP candidates. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming the debate.